Welcome. In this video, we will be continuing our study of the Industrial Revolution. One note about the demographics, the study of populations of what countries were industrializing. The first nation to develop industrialization was England, of course, followed by other parts of the British Isles, such as southern Scotland, for example. But England comes first. Next, in the second wave, is Belgium, France, the United States, and Germany. And they all learn from England's model as they develop machine production that goes along with the Industrial Revolution and actually begin innovating many of the potential industrial developments on their own. Another major shift that comes along with the Industrial Revolution is the shift in social standing, social status, social class. In the pre-industrial world, going back to the Roman Empire days, you had the class of patricians and plebeians. The patrician, the root there being pater, patriae, the father figures, the landlords, and the plebeians, the plebs, the everyone else. And so in some manner of speaking, the haves, the have-nots, landowners, and those who pay rent and toil on the land. Similarly, in the Middle Ages, you had a similar structure. We have in the rural lands, you have the nobility and the peasants, sort of the haves and have-nots, those who sort of own the land and those who pay rent on the land to the lords. And in both situations, you had a relatively small middle class. To be honest, the middle class was possibly larger in the days of the Roman Empire. Now, what is the plight of the poor? Remember that most people in the world, for most of all of human history, were quite poor, and being a poor rural peasant was the normal existence of most people. They have very low freedom. Oftentimes, they're tied to the land. They're not allowed to leave. They're not really paid. Everything they make and eat, they primarily grow themselves. They maybe have some profit left over. Again, it can vary, but they tend to have very little money or no money at all, where they simply grow what they need. And really no way to change their social standing. There's no upward mobility. There's no pathway to go from being a peasant to moving your way up in some form or fashion. In the industrial world, so after Industrial Revolution comes along, rather than a divide between patrician, plebeian, rather than the divide between landowner and tenant farmer or noble and peasant, we have a divide between the wealthy capitalist and the laborer, or between the bourgeoisie, who are businessmen, bankers, stock traders, stock owners, and the proletariat, as Karl Marx is the term he would prefer. Between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, between the capitalist owners, even managers, versus the laboring classes. There still exist nobles and peasants, but this is the new development and the one that will last much deeper into the 19th and 20th centuries. What's the difference between the peasant and the proletariat? If you're the urban factory working poor, they have very poor conditions because factory owners are incentivized to earn as much profit as possible and work the machines as long as possible and their workers as long as possible. And there is little incentive in the market and little pressure from the government or from anyone really to greatly improve the conditions beyond their own moral compunction to treat people with better conditions. They often worked long hours, and there was this mirage of upward social mobility where in theory you could save your money and pull yourself up, but it was exceedingly difficult and rare, even more so in Europe than in the United States, where there were several examples of this, but it was still quite difficult, and for most people was sort of a mirage to think that they could pull themselves up from the position of being a factory worker to one day being an owner. Was very difficult. Conditions were difficult because the workday was quite long. Now, peasants and farmers have long work days from time to time, but as I had stressed in previous videos, they also had off seasons. They often tend to have a lot of downtime in the summer and the winter, especially the winter, and they would work really, really long hours, but there was a sense of direct benefit, right? If they did the work, their crops grew better and they had more food security and maybe food left over that they could barter with and improve their condition. Versus these long work hours were simply par for the course. Everyone worked them because each factory was competing with each other. Safety conditions were poor. There really weren't laws protecting people. There was not, there were no market forces really correcting for this. And so, an owner or a manager was up to his or her own moral compunction as to how safe their own factories would be. Age, people would work well. There's no old age. Retirement is a very modern thing. There's this real thing as retirement. And like on the farm, older people would work, and so would younger people. And so they did in the factories, quite old people and children. Remember, this is before the invention really of public schools. And so, on the farm where parents are around, if you're a peasant, the children is always around. But if the parents have to go to work, then, there's no schools. In general, it was very common for very young children, sometimes as young as single digits. We're talking 6, 8, 9. I think there are reports of kids even younger than 6 working in these factories. Because their nimble and small fingers could get into places that adults couldn't, and they could do certain things for the machines that made children, and you could pay them a lot less. You could get away with paying children a lot less with because they were just children, and so that was a common thing. And again, wages were often quite low. So why are the conditions so bad? If you studied this last year in American history, or if we emphasize this here, we'd say, wow, being a worker is so much worse than being a peasant. Remember, being a peasant was quite bad too in many ways. But what's a big difference? Well, it's very easy in our American and modern mode of thinking to entirely look down on the idea of having nobility or having landed aristocracy who have certain privileges and ownership of large areas of land. But there was a heavy social stigma about who treated their peasants very, very poorly. See, when there was low mobility and a noble and his son and his son and his son, because his father and his father and his father owned the same piece of land, and the same peasants worked for them, and their children and their children and their fathers, and they all worked for each other in succession, that there was a sort of a duty and a relationship there that is lost when you move to the city. And there's lots of people, and there's lots of mobility, and there's competition right next door, that the factory owners feel no sense of, again, we think of a sense of ownership over other people being bad, because in general it is. But when someone with power feels a sense of ownership, or maybe a better word is duty, feels an obligation, a duty to look after. Remember, the root of patrician is father, like a fatherly concern for one's own people, one's own peasants. And some were very, very bad at that, and some were medium, and some were good. But as far as business owners were concerned, factory owners, they did not feel some sort of fatherly concern for their workers. They were brand new to the position of being owners and management, and they didn't know their workers. They didn't know their families, and there was fierce competition. So that's one factor that made conditions very badly, is they were used to, many peasants were used to sort of being looked after by their nobles, even though their nobles lived very well, and by a lot of modern standards, we would say they were exploiting them. There was also a sense of the nobles looking out for their peasants that is gone when you work in a factory. There's really no government regulation of it because they didn't exist, right? Why would the government have laws on the books for how factories should be run when factories didn't exist yet? We live in an era where we're really trying to wrap our heads around how the government might regulate or not regulate the internet or social media or smartphones and things like this. And you say, well, why didn't we already have that? Well, because technology didn't exist yet, and it takes a while to figure out what is appropriate. So there's no government regulation at the time. There's fierce capitalist competition and a race to the bottom to make your product as cheap as possible so that you earn more of the market. And the poor were desperate. They had little where else to go. You had poor relief of the churches and other philanthropic societies, but there was very little else for them to turn to when they were desperate. So what were workers to do? We have 3 key worker reactions I want you to consider. One is migration. Again, remember, many of these people had already migrated from the towns, from the rural areas, the farms, to the towns. That's called urbanization, where they moved from farm to city. Many of them, after having tried the city, felt like that stunk too, and they emigrated and left the country. And so many of these folks, after having for generations been rural farmers in England or Germany or wherever, some of them directly went to the United States and other countries in the Western Hemisphere. Some of them moved to the cities for a generation or two or for a few years, found that that was a poor choice, and many of them who felt that the conditions were not good enough for them migrated to the United States, and many of them could become small family farmers as the frontier was opened, and many small farmers had relatively easy access to land in the United States. Another famous reaction is what happened with the Luddites. These are the machine smashers, the machine breakers. What they would do is they take the name from a myth, the legend of a guy named Captain Ludd, who we don't believe ever actually existed, but he was their mythical leader. And they said that, people who subscribed to his sort of theory was that they would break into these factories in the middle of the night and smash the machines. That way, they could get their old jobs back. A lot of these people were weavers and tailors and people who would make things by hand, but they couldn't compete with the new machine-made goods. And so this became, it was never a majority opinion, but it became pretty widespread in England for many decades, where people would smash the machines of a factory, not to steal them, not because they hated the owner, but merely as a way to try to protect their jobs. We still use this phrase today, usually as a pejorative, as a put-down for anyone who is kind of anti-new technology, even people that are just a little bit skeptical at the ways that some technologies seem to make life harder or worse for some people, because many benefits of technology also come with pros and cons. And so we have the term Luddite. And finally, some of them tried to form unions. Forming unions was largely illegal in most countries, or made illegal, where all of the workers felt like each individual worker has no leverage or bargaining power against the boss. So they would try to combine and form combinations, or also called unions, where in union they would try to collectively bargain with their employer and say that all of us want a raise, or we're all going to quit, or we're all going to go on strike. And when they would do it, the owners would try to bring in strike breakers, pejoratively called scabs. They would often even pay the strike breakers extra. Now then the strikers would try to form a picket line around the factory, and it was not peaceful like it is today, where you might simply say honk to support the union. These were pretty violent affairs, where they would try by force with knives or clubs or their picket signs to prevent strike breakers or other workers from getting into the factory. So at that point, the owners would try to bring in different workers who weren't on strike. Then the strikers would surround the factory and try to beat up the strike breakers who were trying to come into the factory. Then the owners would call the police to arrest the union leaders and the strikers, and they were often these violent confrontations. And for many years, unions were considered sort of dangerous and illegal, and largely had little effect, especially at first. Within time, they would gain certain respect and rights that owners and management would negotiate with union representatives of the large groups of their workers. And so those are three key reactions. When conditions got too poor, they would try to combine with each other with unions. A famous but short-lived solution was to smash the machines themselves to try to prevent the advance of industrial technology. And some simply left, and they said that, that these industrialized urban cities are not for me. And so they emigrated, many of them to the United States or to other countries in hope of more opportunity. Thanks for watching.